to Sprocket's Halloween-themed webinar, Halloween Hack-O-Lantern, Spooky Tales from the Dark Side of Authentication. So just to get started, we're gonna go over a few introductions and then a few housekeeping items, and then Nicholas will get started. So Nicholas, we want to advance to the next slide. All right. So just want to introduce who from the Sprocket team is on this webinar right now. So you have myself, Carly Hochstein, who is the marketing specialist here at Sprocket, and I'm going to be the moderator for this. And then Nicholas, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hey there, everybody. Nicholas Anastasi, Director of Technical Operations at Sprocket Security here. Recognize a ton of faces, well, not faces, but names in the call here, so good to see everybody. For those of you that are new or I haven't met before, I've been at Sprocket for about 4.5 years now and been a penetration tester here for quite a while. Outside of hacking on things, I enjoy running and eating candy, watching movies, that sort of thing. So, yeah, nice to meet everybody, and thank you guys for coming. Awesome.
Okay, and then on the
Next
next
slide
slide,
here.
yep, we just have a few housekeeping items before we get started. So just a few things to go over. This webinar is being recorded and everyone will have access to it afterwards. To join this webinar, you had to make a RevNet account, which is the platform we're on. So to access the recording, just log into your account afterwards and the recording will be there. The next thing is that you're able to take notes throughout this webinar and it will be time-stamped to the recording. So if you see on your right-hand side, there should be a little note section. So feel free to jot anything down that you might want to reference later. And then when you watch the recording afterwards, you can see all the notes you took. And then finally, we will have a Q&A section at the end. So feel free to jot down any questions that you have throughout the webinar, but we will just ask that you stay on mute until the actual Q&A section. And then feel free to ask your questions off mute, or you can just type them in the chat. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Nicholas, to get started.
Awesome. Yeah. So, hop over. I think we thought it might be fun to do a Halloween themed webinar and kind of help everybody finish out the day before they take everybody trick or treating tonight. So, today we're going to be talking about authentication, more specifically what we do as attackers after we compromise a user's credentials. So the focus is going to be on techniques that we use mostly to bypass multi-factor authentication, because it's almost de facto in every organization we work with nowadays. And so no longer can we simply guess credentials and use them immediately. There are other tactics that follow, which is kind of a sign of the times and a very positive thing, right? But kind of want to make everybody here aware of the techniques out there that we're using to bypass different controls. So I'll hop on to the next slide here. So like I mentioned, right, every attack or technique that I described throughout the presentation here is going to kind of hinge on one of these three things that we have up on the slide. So either our team guessed credentials, think, for example, we're password spraying or attempting to guess passwords across a number of organizations and find that one user is using summer 2023 exclamation point. I guess winter now that it's snowing here in Milwaukee, but so let's jump a winter 2023 exclamation point, and we do see that the authentication was successful, but multi-factor authentication is enabled. So that's one scenario that we run into quite often. Additionally, captured credentials. So this kind of hinges on social engineering. If we were able to coerce a user into entering their credentials or providing them in some way, shape, or form, how do we leverage them then when the user has multi-factor authentication enabled? And finally, and kind of in the same vein, is the theft of tokens. So the cookies and other information that's used to authenticate a user to a service, whatever it might be. This is something I'm becoming much more common for the average organization, just because we're seeing the increase in kind of commodity adversary in the middle frameworks out there on the market that we weren't seeing a few years ago. Really high quality, right? Password spraying tools and phishing frameworks are coming onto the market that make kind of are scaling with security skills and operations at larger, more mature organizations here. So um, I just gonna kind of hop through different scenarios, tell stories here. I will keep an eye on the chat if I can figure out how to open it up here, maybe I won't. Carly will interrupt me if we have anything pop up, and let me know. But gonna kind of just dive through techniques here. The first two slides that we're gonna talk to, or first few slides we're gonna walk through, kind of depend on their multi-factor authentication bypass methodologies that depend on social engineering to work. Final slides are going to be more focused on technical controls that we can circumvent or abuse to bypass multi-factor authentication. So the first and kind of most common one that I think a large majority of people here have heard of, just because of its kind of popularity in Microsoft's threat research articles, and also probably on pen tests that maybe we've done in the past, or something along those lines, and with kind of uh, maturing of documentation that's out there for security products is push spamming, or push fatigue is what it's called. So what is still common and still exists out there, but is becoming less common, is the idea that when a user authenticates to a service, the form of multi-factor authentication they need to engage with is a notification that shows up on their phone, and they click yes, this is me logging in, approve it, or they click no. So it was a great kind of start or secondary option to SMS-based MFA that came first, in addition to, well, not necessarily first, but that kind of came in recent years as an option. MFA, push-based MFA is great because it was kind of this happy medium, and it is this happy medium between kind of securing your users, but also reducing authentication friction. One of the biggest things that I think everybody here as security professional knows, you have to walk that fine line where yes, we could enforce 16 character extremely complex passwords, but our help desk is going to be answering, yeah, a lot more password reset requests. Same thing goes with MFA when we enforce users to leverage a hardware token or something along those lines. We're going to have a lot of those get lost. So what we'll do as an attacker is kind of leverage this the the features surrounding push-based MFA to actually coerce a user into approving that push notification. So, right, let's kind of paint a picture here. So, as an attacker, we successfully guessed a user's credentials. When we go to log in, we see that multi-factor authentication is enabled. Generally, the authentication flow that you'll see there, with specifically Microsoft services, once that logs in, you're immediately prompted showing that we sent you a push notification. So that's kind of something we stay aware of, that the second we log in, we know the credentials are valid, that user receives that push. So what we'll do generally, the user will receive that push notification, and depending on the time of day, and what their workflow and schedule and everything looks like, generally what a user should do in reality is look at that push notification and go, this isn't legitimate, and deny it. And usually we might not think much of that. What we'll do as attackers is we'll just send that push notification over and over and over again on a cadence. Sometimes we'll write scripts to do this depending on the authentication portal that we're targeting, and the user will eventually approve that notification because their phone is going off at their on their desk at work, or distracting them during a meeting, and they'll go, ah, that's okay. Another reason they might do it, and this is exceedingly common as well, or became very common with push-based MFA, and something I've experienced myself just using different tech stacks. When you lose internet connection temporarily, for example, and you're connected to a VPN appliance, as soon as you go to your internet connection comes back and you re-authenticate, you're just going to start getting those MFA prompts on a cadence, and so you just assume that something happened, and you might just approve the push notification. So, what we'll do to kind of coerce users, or kind of fabricate that scenario, is generally what I've done in the past. The user that we've compromised, I go on LinkedIn, I find out where they're physically located in the United States or wherever it might be. figure out what time I would assume they would start working in the morning. So let's say 9 a.m. I wait till about 10 minutes, 15 minutes after they've started working, and they just went through the whole cadence and schedule of their morning of approving every push to log into everything they're possibly using. And then subsequently, we just start push spamming 15 minutes later, and they go, "Oh, something must not have worked, or something got I lost internet connection right after I logged into the VPN, something along those lines," and they'll prove it. The thing that you're seeing, right, that's kind of came along after the fact here, specifically with push-based MFA in response to it, is one, number matching, which we'll talk about in the next slide as a MFA method or kind of a secondary MFA method. But then additionally, some location context awareness in the push notification that was sent during the, you know, so for example, Duo added, and you'll see it in push based MFA with Duo. Uh, Even if you're still just saying yes or no, this was me logging in, you'll get a location or location information that's shown there to give you an idea. Hey, I'm in New York, I'm not in Russia, and the user should deny based on that. The problem that you'll see is either after you're being push spammed so much, you can send them in like bursts so they don't really even think about it. They'll just approve it regardless, or that information is not very readily displayed and shown, which Microsoft has actually tried to address with their Authenticator app, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here. But the fix for this one is push-based MFA is not a good multi-factor authentication method. It's simply just it's so easily abused and it's so often misconfigured that my recommendation nowadays, if you're using it and there isn't some if you're using it as your primary multi-factor authentication method for end users at your organization, try to shift away from it from as fast as possible. I believe, and I don't want anybody to quote me on this, but Microsoft de facto, as part of their MFA solution, now does number matching and shows location information and all of that. There are some other providers that are lagging behind, and I would assume that it's also possible on the part of an administrator to actually configure MFA insecurely or in this fashion. A great story, and then I'll hop onto the next slide along this line. So we were testing an organization, I would say it was about a year ago now, and what they were doing when users were authenticating to a Cisco VPN appliance, right? They uh, when you configure any kind of VPN appliance with Duo, specifically, generally what you'll see is out of the box you configure it can configure it so a username can be entered and then push is entered as the password. And you wouldn't know that unless you've set it up before. But what we'll try very often, right, when I get to a Cisco SSL VPN that's using Duo, I'll enter the username and I'll enter push and I'll see if the login attempt hangs so it doesn't authenticate me right away. We found with this organization, I could enter a username and push into the password field and just push spam my way into the VPN appliance without ever requiring a password. It's not very common, but it does happen. And I think a lot of people here are like, that's crazy. I would never do that. But if you take a look at some documentation out there, it can at times recommend that you go that route in addition to adding certificates to the underlying operating system. But some people don't do that. So push based MFA can completely result into compromise of an organization, and push spamming has been the crux of full entire compromises that we've or attack chains we've gone through before. So um, hopping on to the next slide though, in response to these problems surrounding push based MFA, Microsoft said, right, I let's implement number matching as a kind of second or a an MFA methodology. So instead of a user saying yes or no when they authenticate to their account, and they will a number will pop up on the screen on their mobile device. They'll receive a notification. In that notification, it'll show the location of the user that or the location that the authentication attempt originated from that triggered that MFA push to their device. but then in addition, the IP address, source IP address, and a little box where you can enter those numbers that are being displayed on the screen. So a great you know, in response to this, right, it seems like a user has to physically be in front of their device looking at the logged in screen, and they need to enter this information, right? So they have to physically be looking at it and know something and X, Y, and Z. And I had a great, right, and this will lead into the rest of the slide, but we were at an event maybe a couple months ago now, and the speaker was talking about different MFA methods and kind of what they're doing nowadays. And they said, Nicholas, Sprocket team, what do you guys do when you run into number matching? I'm sure there's some great bypasses out there. And our joke was, yeah, we just call them and ask for it. And everybody here would be, it's a lot more common and a lot more successful than you would probably imagine, especially under certain circumstances. So, what we'll do, and this is extremely successful during social engineering engagements where we're able to capture credentials. We'll attempt to find the user's phone number. So we have a username. Let's hold on. I'm gonna step back and we'll set the stage here. So I send out a phishing email. User clicks the link. They enter their credentials. And after they've entered their credentials, I go to log in. I see number matching is in place, or alternatively, SMS-based MFA is in place. So when I log in, they get a text to their phone, and then they have to take that code from their phone and enter it onto the screen. Um, or they're using TOTP-based MFA, where when I go to log in, it says enter your code that's being generated. So this user, right, that we successfully have compromised their username and password, and we know there's a form of MFA in the methods I just described in place. What we'll do then is we move forward trying to find information about this user. So we'll go to LinkedIn. The team is much better at this than I am anymore, but usually we can find a cell phone number relatively quickly using OSINT and other online sources. We'll find that user's cell phone number and call them directly. Alternatively, right, getting this phone number for this calling and asking for these codes can be difficult at times, and so there's a couple alternate methods, excuse me, that we may use. So one is I will call the front desk of the office, or if I can find of the organization, or I'll find a phone number for a specific department that I know the user is working in, or at times even an adjacent department where they don't directly know the person or they're not in a cubicle box like right next to them. I'll call, I'll go, hey, I was just talking to so and so. I got disconnected. I can't keep talking to them right now. Can you give me a direct extension or phone number I can call them back? They'll look in the internal employee directory and they'll provide that phone number. And then we'll go ahead and then recall the user. Another option as well, there are some instances where there's like a robo directory present. These are relatively limited, it seems, but we do run into them from time to time where you can call a directory service at the organization and just start saying the name of the person until it gets you somewhere, or you can kind of start asking and bouncing around until you get to the employee's desk. This is the least preferable option, one with remote work being much more common and users kind of relying on cell phones or Teams to communicate. That it people might have a VoIP phone at their house, but it's not, super common because it's a big cost and setup on the part of IT admins. But we can use that as a method to make our way to the phone number of a user or talk to them. So what we'll do after we've almost confidently, relatively confidently identified a phone number, is use a service like SpoofCard. SpoofCard is an app for for mobile phones for iOS and Android that you can install. That up until recently, you could enter any number you wanted to and pose as that number calling another number. So it even has some other features that are especially useful for us as ethical testers, where we can record the entire contents of the call. But what we would do generally, right, once we have this user's cell phone number, we'd get a phone number of somebody at the organization. Generally, you don't have to be that complex with it, just because of the auto caller detection that iOS and Android has built into their devices now. So, for example, if there's Acme Corp LLC, if I find their main phone number for the organization right online, and then I fake that number to call another user, it's likely that it'll show up on their caller ID as that organization in some way, shape, or form. Just because Google has already indexed the number, Apple has already indexed the number, so um, likely it'll just pop over. So from the user's perspective, they see Acme Corp direct calling them, or they just recognize the number, or that's a work phone and it's already in their directory somehow, right? So we get on the phone with the user. In the best case scenario, like I was talking about, where we've actually socially engineered the user into providing a username and password, there is a great pretext that we'll use. We'll pretend to be security and we'll say, "We think you might have just gotten phished. Did you log into anything from an email recently?" The user will say, "Yes, we know they did." And we'll go, "Yeah, that was a phishing email. It's not one of our test ones or simulated ones. We're going to need you to, we have to reset your password and a couple other things." So go through the process of actually, saying, "All right, verify the last four digits of your cell phone number," things that we already know and we're asking them, but just kind of to build the legitimacy, or say like uh, any kind of identity verification thing. And then following that, what we'll do is we'll trigger that MFA push, either if it's SMS or the number matching based MFA, and I'll either say, "Okay, you should have gotten a push notification on your phone. Enter the code," and I'll provide them with the number. They approve it. I get logged in. Other option is, "Hey, you just should have gotten a text message. Provide me with that code," or it's usually the bouncing around of me pretending like I don't know what type of MFA they're using. So I'll say, "Do you use like an app to get a code when you log in?" Could be Authy. I'll just start listing services like Authy, Microsoft Authenticator, Duo, and they'll eventually, they'll go, "Oh yeah, I use Duo," and I'll say, "All right, there should be a code in there. Can you provide it to me?" They'll provide it. This is a relatively successful or reliable technique for us, as kind of a MFA bypass method. Alternate option or alternate scenario where you've guessed the username and password of the user is a little bit more difficult. So when you call the user out of the blue and ask them for their MFA code, you have to be a little bit. I've found not aggressive, but more so like very specific in what you're asking for, and use a little bit more social engineering finesse than you would on the social engineering security team kind of pretext that I described. So generally, we'll find some sort of if it's the end of the month, I'll be like, "Did you just do the security awareness training thing?" Or "Have you talked to IT recently?" Things that like they probably did that I can use as a jumping off point, but generally it'll also go through the path of, we think a few users were compromised, and go down a very similar route to the first scenario that I described. Long story short, right? We end up being provided with that code, and then we can log into the account, take the session token from that logged in service, and go from there. And kind of continue to leverage the authenticated session for that user. Couple things to note and remediation steps surrounding this. One, and this is really hard to tell users, because they're like, "What am I supposed to do?" You have to let people know that a caller ID is not to be trusted. So when a number calls that appears to be, uh, your organization, they can't innately trust it, especially on their cell phone. This is even more difficult with when it looks like the call came from inside the house, right? Sticking in the Halloween theme, i.e., it was transferred to you, or transferred to them from the front desk, or from the front desk over to them, and it looks internal. And so I think it's easy to just go, "Hey, don't trust caller ID." I don't think that's the best idea, right? Instead, as part of security awareness training, a focus on security awareness training and policies and procedures internally for verification surrounding like any IT administrative actions that are taken. And so kind of verifying questions or some sort of like digital means of ensuring that the person that you're talking to is the real person if you've never spoken with them before. Again, this is something that is easy to share in practice with users, but actual execution in the real world, one, you have no visibility over it, which is really tough, especially from like as an administrator, or alternatively, taking a kind of hard stance during security awareness training surrounding trusting, callers, and then simulating that to kind of integrate it into training. Best case scenario with us that we've seen here is when we're able to do it successfully at an organization, it gives their team great kind of leverage to specifically showcase that real world attackers can do this, et cetera, et cetera. On top of that, again, probably with number matching and all of these other kind of MFA methodologies, I won't say get rid of SMS based MFA as a solution here, and I'm going to get up on my soapbox for a minute and say that SMS based MFA is not necessarily innately insecure. SIM swapping nowadays is a technique for gaining access to users' phone numbers and actually getting those MFA codes is it's much easier to call the user and ask for it than it is to actually SIM swap a user to actually to get their MFA code sent directly to you. In general, it's more here a focus on security awareness training. That's kind of the easy one. That's the thing you can implement today. But then, in addition, implement hardware keys. I feel like right in the industry, we just keep tacking on more things that you have to buy and implement, and more user friction that you have to put into place. But passwordless and MFA keys are the future. It's just going to take some company out there, and some are trying and doing relatively well, making that process really, really easy for not only the end user to utilize those services, but also IT administrators to manage it. So, um, yeah, I long-winded explanation. I wish I had a video or a phone call that I could play for everybody right now, but I cannot, unfortunately, with kind of the line of work that we do. But there's some great examples related to this out there. Recently, Microsoft, I think their most recent threat intel article showcased somebody using text messages directly with the user to ask for passwords and coerce them into providing passwords for their company account. Also, some other cases, the recent MGM attack where they coerced an IT administrator to reset to MFA methods for a specific account. There's different techniques. The help desk based MFA bypass stuff or security control circumvention thing is getting more and more popular. Instead of targeting an individual, targeting a department, et cetera, et cetera. So, um, excuse me, real quick. I feel like I'm doing a report delivery. The next things we're gonna touch on and talk about here are not based on social engineering, but instead focused on technical control bypasses surrounding MFA. So one of the things that is becoming increasingly common, either transparently to IT and security administrators, or kind of on the back end as part of a platform. Transparency, more so Microsoft. Back end, think one login or Okta or some other federated identity provider, are the idea of conditional access policies. So that's what Microsoft calls them. I believe Okta has a different, it's like an adaptive MFA is what they call it. But really, it all kind of boils down to the same thing. So, conditional access policies, kind of as a broad term, is a method for an IT or security administrator to configure scenarios in which a user is prompted for a second level of multi-factor authentication, or even a second and third level, depending on the risk of the sign-in that they're performing, or the authentication attempt that they're performing, or other criteria that the user might meet. So I'll explain like a common scenario here real quick. So Conditional access policy might state, and I'll give two examples, one kind of an allow based rule and a deny based rule. So, a deny based rule might look something like this as a conditional access policy. If a user attempts to log in from outside of uh, Spain, where my organization is located, if they try to log in from anywhere outside of Europe, that user might not travel. So a login attempt comes from the United States, South Korea, wherever it might be out there in the world. That login attempt should require a second level of multi-factor, or they should it should require multi-factor authentication and some other kind of qualifying information for that user, or alternatively block that authentication attempt altogether. So right there, we would say there's no way a user at my organization should be logging in from outside of our country or continent. And that's a method of kind of denying authentication, or at least protecting an authentication attempt a little bit more based on the geolocation of the user. Alternatively, let's think about an allow policy, and this one is extremely common. So, if my users are physically at my organization, so a user is sitting in a pod of cubicles at my company at our physical office, and they attempt to log into their O365 account from that location with a company an IP that's associated with my company. So if they're exiting the network through something we control, let's either say the physical location, or it could be a full tunnel VPN connection, don't prompt them for MFA. We assume that they had to already go through some other form of second factor authentication to authenticate to whatever service it is. Whether it's a physical building, you need to have your ID badge, that's a second form of authentication, or you logged into the VPN, which means you had to provide MFA to get through the VPN to access services. So that's more of an allow based policy. What you'll find with conditional access policies and kind of the documentation surrounding them, they can get very complex, and there are also a lot of edge cases. So there are some tools out there for analyzing conditional access policies and looking at existing ones associated with your organization. For example, think Road Recon is a tool for doing this. A couple other Python scripts out there that I don't remember the name of off the top of my head, but the long story short here, right? It's very easy to misconfigure your conditional access policy for your organization. So, what we'll see most often, and this is one that was actually defaultly part of Microsoft's pre-built conditional access policies for quite a while. They filtered based on platform. So certain levels of MFA or flagging around authentication attempts would happen based on the source operating system that the authentication attempt was coming from. They didn't include Linux in the platform strings that were disallowed. So they said if you log in from Mac OS and or a Microsoft Windows system and log in, and then you meet some other criteria, then trigger an MFA prompt. You were able to kind of hop the cap by just sending a Linux user agent along with your authentication attempt, and then you didn't get into the specific flow that would trigger that MFA prompt. So that was a very common one. The other thing, and I'll hop over to the next page here, is the idea that and excuse me for I'm not super in the weeds on this stuff. There are guys that spend their whole life kind of in this realm, but the authentication endpoints surrounding, right, when you log into a Microsoft service or any federated identity service, you get claims. There are IDs associated with that authentication attempt. I'll give you an example or throw this out there. So if you go to, I believe, msportals.io, there's a large list of different Microsoft portals that you can log into. If you click on any of them, uh, you'd have to do this in a private browser. You will get redirected to a base Microsoft login page. somewhere out there. Very similar to if your company uses G Suite for services, whatever it might be. So the services are all federated. Um, what happens though, if you look in the URL, when you click that link and go to authenticate, is you get a client ID associated with you and all of this other information that kind of provides the authentication provider with information about your login attempt so it can properly route you to different services. So if clicked skype.microsoft.com, I don't know if that's a URL, but if I click on anything like that, right, it's going to take me to the Microsoft Online login page. I'll have specific criteria that or specific information that's passed along as metadata with that click. So think headers or URL parameters, that sort of thing. And then when I log in, I'll get redirected to Skype. Right. Worst example I could have given because nobody's using Skype anymore. But what'll happen then with it gets even more complex. So when I build conditional access policies now, I might, under certain circumstances, when a user tries to log into a specific application from a mobile device, for example, right? I know that a subsection of my users at my organization are not logging in from a location that they can easily approve an MFA prompt. If trying to if somebody there's a construction worker and they're up in a building somewhere that they don't have a signal, or they're a foreman at an organization doing construction work, I might say that, hey, this user doesn't have to enter MFA under these very specific circumstances because I know they can't do it reliably or safely or whatever it might be. What we can do as attackers, however, is kind of find that edge case. So there are tools like Teams filtration and other conditional access policy analyzers out there, or authentication attempt providers out there that will try to shuffle the platforms that you're coming through the authentication source that you're coming from. So it might try to log into Skype for Business with a client ID for some other random the Graph XML API, whatever it is, and use a Linux user agent, and it'll just sit and iterate through those slowly. And so sometimes, right, if you know that Defender for Identity or other cap is in play for whatever reason, you can try this over the course of a day or so to see if you can bypass controls. This is not as common as it used to be. It used to be much, much more common in my experience, but not seeing it as often, definitely. And, and so something to keep an eye out for. Conditional access policies are hard to configure. My recommendation generally is don't use Microsoft, but I know that doesn't fly for a lot of companies, right? I like Okta, even though they keep getting breached, or other federated identity providers, because they kind of do this logic for you, and they're a little bit more intelligent about it on the back end. They use AI and machine learning, that sort of thing. But there's a lot of great documentation out there surrounding conditional access policies. Really look to make sure that the people who are configuring it and setting it up really know what they're doing and have done it before. Skipping on to the next thing here, though, because we're getting kind of close on time a little bit. Uh, Device code based MFA bypasses. So this is something that I think we've probably seen out there a little bit more in recent months. It's can be difficult to execute on, but device code based MFA bypasses are common. I'm seeing them more and more. Really, if you think, right, when you go to log into Netflix on your Apple TV, right, for example, you can sit there and type in your entire username and password, but you can also go to netflix.com/auth or whatever it is, and log in from your mobile device, enter a code that's up on the screen, and then it'll pass your authentication attempt onto the streaming device, and you're logged into Netflix, right? Microsoft has the same thing. Couldn't tell you why. No, I know why, but this authentication flow doesn't really ever. It's hard to get it to fall under conditional access policies and there are certain edge cases with like larger organizations where device code auth might be required in certain cases, and MFA enforcement and things are a little bit more difficult. The only reason I threw this in the slide is I was trying to bypass cap and spent a lot of time on it with an organization in the last like 6 months, and ended up boiling down to authenticating using a device code to Microsoft and providing a Mac OS platform string or user agent. So this is very like weird fringe edge case methodology for bypassing MFA. Final one, and I think this might be familiar to some people in the room here that have seen me do it before, but and talk about it before. Favorite thing and a thing I've been not obsessed with, but written a lot of code surrounding and liked for years is Exchange Web Services. Just a programmatic way of interacting with O365 and other mail services. Originally invented and used on Microsoft Exchange, Microsoft had to port it to their cloud instance of Outlook to support older mail clients that did not support or did not work with modern authentication mechanisms that they have in place. And so a big offender of this is Duo. It's less common now, but with Duo, you could have MFA fully configured, but you could talk to the EWS endpoint in O365 directly. I'd recommend you try it. If you go to outlook.office365.com/EWS, I believe you will still be prompted for basic authentication. They're looking, I'm going to check right now. Might be wrong. Uh, EWS. Yes. So when you go to that page, you're going to get hit with a 401, which means you didn't authenticate or send any authentication information. It's basically basic auth that you can use to access services. This is common as well and can show up right under the authentication endpoints bucket as a method for bypassing MFA. It surprises me how much it still works because Microsoft can't get rid of it. They just simply can't. It's proven very difficult for them and a lot of organizations out there in the world. So this is another method we'll try as a technical control bypass. And finally, Carly, how much time am I at?
We have about 17 minutes left. We still want to do a Q&A as well.
Yes. Okay. Awesome. So I'll race through this last part here. One of the other really common kind of tactics and techniques, and something that we're seeing at scale, kind of like I talked about in the beginning, that wasn't seen previously, is adversary in the middle attacks, where instead of just stealing a username and password, you're stealing the entire session token of the user upon authentication. So, what we'll do, right, is proxy, or attackers will do, is proxy authentication attempts to a legitimate portal. We're doing a social engineering engagement right now today that's using this technique, and we did a very similar thing about a month and a half ago for any of our customers that are in the crowd here, where when the user authenticates, they this kind of intermediary proxy. It looks like they successfully authenticate to the service, and then but we're sitting in the middle, capture that username and password and their cookie that they're using, that they'll get on upon successful authentication. With that cookie, MFA is basically null and void. So unless you have hardware tokens and kind of other detection capabilities surrounding the authentication process, at best what this will do is actually just trigger an alert as a risky sign in Azure AD. If you're looking at an organization with 10,000 employees, did, flagging on that and actually acting upon it is much easier said than done. And so, what we'll do is just take that token, leverage it to authenticate on our own, and bypass MFA completely, so we don't have to do all of this other funky stuff. One of the kind of common things we'll do here as well. So, if we're able to capture an authentication token to like a VDI service, like a virtual desktop environment, and we grab that token. We put it in a browser in a virtual machine that just sits and continuously reloads the page every 5 minutes. so that cookie stays valid even after the user might log out on their end, and then we can use that cookie almost infinitely, or at least like wait till the end of the day to gain access and that sort of thing. Token theft, I'm hearing kind of from everybody, is an adversary in the middle attacks are much more common than they used to be. It was very popular for a while to just straight up fish users because we didn't see MFA in place, and then actually taking frameworks like Evil Jinx and other services and scaling them to the level that real world attackers are, using, was very difficult. I haven't seen the commodity phishing toolkits that are being used nowadays for this, but it sounds like they are relatively um, sophisticated, and the people making them are competent. It's really kind of things are changing significantly, but this is another thing to keep an eye out for. Some recent testing surrounding it with a customer of ours really kind of showcased that regardless of what we did for security controls, Microsoft didn't stop this. At best, they forced the user to reset their password maybe a couple hours after we gained access. But in theory, with the username and password and that token, could be possible to add an additional level of an additional MFA factor to the account, go through a ton of different processes to kind of retain that persistence even after the user reset their password, like I described. So that's fun one as well, and something we're doing a lot more often. I'll kind of jump in summary here, and then I think we can have a lot more fun conversations surrounding what we talk about. Should be a good time. It's always going to be the cat and mouse game with this sort of stuff. Security awareness training is key. A focus on specifically testing the technical controls and doing security awareness training, or doing phishing simulations that drive your security or security awareness training platforms is extremely important. So, what we'll do as attackers is different than what Know Before or other services might be able to onboard into their platform. Real kind of humans are always going to be faster than an entire development team and threat intel team, and kind of getting that onboarded, tested, pushed out to customers, that sort of thing. And so, um, the techniques we're trying could be a week old, or a GitHub repository that we just found that was written a week ago, and then we're trying to pretext the next day. Our social engineering emails that we send out are usually just based on somebody in our chat going, "I just got this marketing email that looks like, or this email from Microsoft that looks like it'd be a really good phishing email, and we'll craft it and get it out the door when we can." So, um, all of that is to say, right, you can implement as many technical controls in the world as you want, or pay as much as you want for kind of technical, like security prevention toolkits and identity protection toolkits, but security awareness training is really key in the modern workplace and kind of surrounding all of this. So our big push is not telling people really to spend more money on security when it comes to the techniques we're doing here, but instead kind of spend the time training and providing realistic scenarios to end users. And yeah, I guess outside of that, I appreciate everybody listening and going through it today. I will kind of open the floor for questions if anybody has any. I'm gonna take a drink of water here real quick.
Question over here.
Yes, sir.
So, in regards to web applications and those session tokens becoming more and more popularized for their users, what are like some high-level steps we can take to prevent some of the risks that you've outlined in your last slide?
So what I'm seeing, and I've been trying to do a little bit more research surrounding this, but it seems to be hardware tokens are the key here. But like I mentioned kind of earlier in the presentation too, deployment is not it's not a simple undertaking for those. So there's FIDO authentication and other services out there, or kind of protocols out there and standards do a lot better job at protecting against things like this. But ag- I'll throw this out there too, and just be honest with everybody in the room. I'm the hacker, not the defender, always. And so, if anybody in the crowd as well knows of some good solutions on the market outside of just saying use UB keys, would be a cool thing to share as well. But that kind of answers your question, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Nicholas.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. I can't see the chat if there's anything popping up.
Yes, one just came in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, so the question is regarding SMM, oh my God, MFA. Security people always say it's insecure, but has there ever been an actual attack where someone intercepts the message to bypass MFA?
Yeah, so there's a lot of good they're Darknet Diaries episodes, podcasts where they're talking to not necessarily hackers of larger organizations to deploy ransomware, but instead attackers that are focused on doing things like stealing Bitcoin wallets, or purely monetary based attackers that aren't looking to go whaling for large organizations, but instead look at individuals. That is where you're seeing MFA, or like SIM swapping and other attacks for SMS based MFA bypasses become very, very common, sort of in that space. SMS or SIM swapping, for the most part nowadays, from what I understand, to actually intercept that code, um, really does hinge on the ability to get physical access to the tablets that the provider or the cellular carrier managers use in branch locations. So, what they're doing to actually do these SIM swaps are going into these branch locations, stealing the tablet, and they get about 15 minutes to do SIM swaps. And so they're charging at on average, like, it's 10 grand plus. So it's not like, $1,000 even. An attacker has to be very determined, know that SMS based MFA is in play, and have a lot of other prerequisite information and connections to do it. Now, that might be true of the average attacker out there. I can't speak for nation state actors and other hacking groups that might have access to T-Mobile's internal network, but I don't think there was any evidence of lapses doing it when they had access to T-Mobile. It was more so some other kind of information collection techniques. So, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know off the top of my head of any instances of it occurring, with any of the organizations we've worked with, but it's definitely possible and doable. Everything is given, determination of an attacker and how bad they want to get in, basically. So, trying to figure. Yeah, awesome, awesome.
All right, does anybody have any other last minute questions? Or we might just wrap it up here.
Okay.
All right. Well, Nicholas, you just want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, yeah.
If anybody has any other questions in the last few minutes, we can answer those quickly. But we just want to thank everyone for joining us for our webinar. And we want to tease our next one coming up with Nate Fair from Sprocket, that it will be happening the Tuesday after Thanksgiving on November 28th. And he's going to be talking about some physical penetration stuff. So watch for some emails for those, or head over to our social accounts and follow us, and you will see more information about that coming soon.
Yeah, and I'll just throw out there, Nate's member of the team, and I've worked with him for a really, really long time. This one will be super fun. Nate just recently did a physical penetration testing engagement. We've been doing a few more this year, so Nate's awesome. He'll do a great job. It'll be a fun one with a lot of cool pictures. I already know a couple that are going to make their way into that presentation that might get some laughs. So it'll be exciting. So awesome.
All right, well, I don't see any more questions coming in, so with that, I'm going to